Let me welcome everyone to this ministerial session of the 2022 OECD International Conference on AI in Work, Innovation, Productivity and Skills, what we also call the AI WIPS, hosted by the OECD and perhaps even more importantly, supported by the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. I am Ulrik Vestergaard Knudsen, Deputy Secretary General here at the OECD, and it's my profound pleasure and honor to moderate this particular session on shaping coherent policies for AI. A very distinguished set of speakers will be joining us to discuss the policy action that's needed to make the most of AI technologies, while ensuring at the same time, of course, that AI upholds shared social values and individual rights. The conference, as you may know, is part of the OECD's AI WIPS program, aiming to unpack the implications of fast evolving changes in AI capabilities and diffusion for the world. We will start with remarks by Matthias Cormann to my left, Secretary General of the OECD, and then by His Excellency Hubertus Heil, German Federal Minister of Labor and Social Affairs. We will then continue with remarks and a short discussion on AI education and skills with Her Excellency Kersti Kaljulaid, former President of Estonia. But without further ado, let me give the floor to Matthias Cormann. Matthias, please.
Thank you very much, Ulrik, Minister Heil, President Kaljulaid, dear Kersti, friends. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this ministerial session of the 2022 edition of the OECD International Conference on Artificial Intelligence in Work, Innovation, Productivity and Skills. Throughout this week, more than 70 speakers in 18 sessions have highlighted the opportunities and challenges that artificial intelligence brings to our societies. The potential of artificial intelligence is, of course, immense. And this is also illustrated by the sharp increase in funding for artificial intelligence, from less than $3 billion US in 2012 to $75 billion US in 2020. At the same time, the development, diffusion, and use of artificial intelligence technologies are still at relatively low levels across our economies. While many large firms and some young and innovative firms now use artificial intelligence in a variety of applications, few small and medium-sized enterprises use it as a matter of course, or if they do, it is mostly at a comparatively basic level. For example, in 2020, 34% of large firms in the European Union use big data analytics compared to just 12% of small firms. To ensure that more firms can benefit from the innovation and productivity enhancing effects of artificial intelligence, helping to maintain a genuinely competitive market, greater diffusion of this technology to smaller firms will be very important. With more widespread use, artificial intelligence will have a significant impact on the labor market and on skills demand. As artificial intelligence makes progress in automating non-routine cognitive tasks, such as information ordering or deductive reasoning, there is a change in occupations that are considered the most exposed to that transformation. This concerns high-skilled occupations, for instance, managerial or legal occupations, which contrasts with the impact of previous automating technologies, which mainly impacted on lower-skilled workers. These effects might change significantly over time as the capabilities of artificial intelligence continue to advance. We need to regularly update our understanding of these advances. Higher exposure to artificial intelligence can be positive for workers, as long as they have the skills to use these technologies effectively. OECD work shows that rather than displacing high-skilled workers, artificial intelligence tends to complement their skills, bringing higher productivity and wages. Think of a radiologist who can use artificial intelligence to help better interpret exam results, or a teacher who can use learning analytics to differentiate students' pedagogical practices. Our work shows that artificial intelligence contributes to overall productivity, but only when combined with investment in skills, process innovation, and organizational changes. The capabilities of artificial intelligence have evolved exponentially, whereas learning outcomes have not improved in most countries, according to the Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA. Training will be so important, including on how to effectively use AI systems as part of business. Ideally, we would also see a proportional increase in the diversity of artificial intelligence developers. More women, a broader range of nationalities, a broader range of ethnic backgrounds. There are concerns that the type of tasks that artificial intelligence is performing may raise ethical challenges in the workplace. Indeed, in the 2021 survey, 44% of respondents in developed countries expressed concerns about the use of artificial intelligence at work. 41% were concerned about privacy, 30% about equity and fairness. We owe it to our citizens to ensure that artificial intelligence contributes to a brighter future of work. The OECD project on artificial intelligence in work, innovation, productivity, and skills, generously supported by Germany, is improving the metrics we have on artificial intelligence, and it is helping us develop insights on the implications of artificial intelligence technologies for economies and society. We're making all of this work available at the OECD.AI Observatory. The next important task is to identify policies to maximize the benefit of artificial intelligence while addressing some of the risks and challenges associated with it. And not all artificial intelligence is, of course, the same. We need to better understand the risks associated with different types of artificial intelligence. The consequences of an error in artificial intelligence-powered loans can be much more serious than for an AI-powered movie recommendation. To help assess and classify artificial intelligence systems according to their impact, we just launched on Tuesday a user-friendly framework for classifying artificial intelligence systems. This will help policymakers adopt a risk-based approach to artificial intelligence governance. We also see through this conference policies emerge which countries may want to consider to promote the diffusion of artificial intelligence across the economy. These policies aim to support workers who may need to move to different jobs through upskilling, reskilling, better skills matching, and to prevent increased disparities due to artificial intelligence. We need safeguards to ensure a trustworthy adoption of artificial intelligence in the workplace, consistent with the 2019 OECD AI principles, the first intergovernmental standard on artificial intelligence. This means respecting laws, human rights, and democratic values with transparency, disclosure, and accountability around artificial intelligence systems. The last and key point, in all these policy areas, we will need to engage in positive and constructive social dialogue. We will need to bring social partners together to ensure a smooth and inclusive transition in artificial intelligence. The OECD project on artificial intelligence in work, innovation, productivity, and skills will continue to build the evidence base to help support those efforts. This project will contribute to national and international initiatives in this field in collaboration with the G7, the G20, and the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, as well as the European Union, among others, so that together we can ensure that artificial intelligence is human-centric and genuinely conducive to greater well-being, both in the world of work and in society in general, and in order to help public authorities to take advantage of the many benefits of the digital transformation while managing the risks, challenges, and disruptions it comes with. You can continue to count on the OECD to support all stakeholders in achieving these important objectives. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thank you, Matthias, for those remarks. And we are indeed proud of the work that we've been doing through the AI WIPS program. We have been developing a classification of AI. We're assessing AI and robotics capabilities, as well as the diffusion of AI and its impact on labor markets and skills. As Matthias indicated, we've also been engaging in continuous policy and societal dialogue on these questions. But the point here is that none of this, however, would have been possible without the generous support of the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. So it's my very, very big pleasure to introduce now the remarks from Minister Heil, who will speak about the impact of AI on jobs and society.
Secretary General Corman, ladies and gentlemen, technologies such as artificial intelligence can make the future better, not only on health systems, but almost all areas of life. At the same time, we need a responsible way of using these technologies. In the United States, there is an intensive discussion about the social impact of technological progress. The economist Darren Achalabu participate in your conference on Monday. His research shows the following. Automation is one of the main reasons for the increasing wage gap in the United States. Social inequality is becoming worse there. His lesson? There are alternatives to this outcome. To quote, it's the result of choices corporations and we as society have made about to use technology. How to use technology? This question is also on the agenda of the AI WIPS. We are looking at the impact of the use of AI. There is no question about our basic view. We say yes to technological progress. But this progress must go hand in hand with a social added value, with benefits not just for individuals, but for all of society. We can only achieve this if we set the agenda and if we establish a clear framework. We also need enough knowledge. That is especially important. Progress needs trust and trust needs knowledge. This gets me to AI WIPS. At this point, I would like to say a big words of thanks. I would like to thank everybody who has made AI WIPS a success. And what is more, you have done this in the middle of a global pandemic. AI WIPS has given important answers to many questions, questions that come with the digital transformation. These findings come at exactly the right time. They have received a lot of international attention at the EU, at the G7 and the G20. And they provide inputs for a new approach to regulation, both at national and international levels. The European AI regulation is still in the development phase, but is the first try to establish both comprehensive and targeted rules. Ladies and gentlemen, your classification of AI had a great influence on the regulation debate in the European Union. And you are setting a new standards. You can be proud of this. For me, AI WIPS is more than a research project. It is also part of a political mandate. You are making a couple of things clear. First, technological innovation and social responsibility do not contradict each other. Second, fair structural change is possible. Third, it is a job of policymakers to define the framework in a dialogue with experts. However, many questions are still open. For this reason, we have agreed to extend AI WIPS by 3 years. For this, we will continue to provide financial resources. I would now like to highlight 4 points. In view of the extension, they seem especially important to me. First, how can we put the risks of artificial intelligence into categories? How can we arrive at a systematic assessment of risks? It is clear that there are different sorts of AI. If Netflix gives me advice on new movies, this is not really dangerous. Maybe apart from arguments with your partner, if she or he has a completely different taste. But let us look at those who bring the food for our Netflix evening, the pizza we have ordered with just a few clicks. For these riders, risks are a totally different story. Their online platforms often monitor everything they do. How fast did I ride? Was I on time? How quickly do I accept the next order? These working conditions come close to exploitation. Let us now think a little further. Our rider no longer wants to deliver pizzas. Instead, he applies for an office job at a large online shopping company. Let us imagine that he has a work history with many different jobs. That is a problem. The recruiting algorithm will immediately throw out his application. I am not inventing these risks. They have been a reality for quite some time. We have to deal with this. At the same time, it is possible that we see the same technology in different ways. Technology is neither good nor bad. It depends on the application, on the how to use. A software that can recognize faces and objects is very helpful for people with poor eyesight. But the same software can be very dangerous if it is used to watch everybody and everything all the time. Another example, AI can help to identify an illness earlier. This can be very good for medical treatment. But what if people then experience discrimination, for example, in their everyday life or at work, since it is now known that this person may have an illness which doctors have not yet identified? Smart regulation of AI must take into account such dilemmas. I welcome the fact that the EU regulation includes different standards for different risk levels. Second point, what do we do with all the data which AI collects? This especially applies to work. For workers, it is difficult to know what happened with their data. At some companies, AI is already influencing almost all areas of human resources management, from a recruitment to performance assessment, and also many other questions. For example, the question, who gets which training? Here we also need clear rules. We need a sort of highway code on companies' data autobahn. That is why we will present an Employee Data Protection Act in Germany. Employees should be sure that their sensitive data is protected. Third, what can AI do and what can it not do? How can we measure the competences of technologies? AI Whips aims to develop a kind of PISA test for machines. I think that is a good idea. It helps to answer important questions. Where is the interface between humans and machines? Which competences will be demanded on the future? And which skills will workers need? That is of critical importance for our skills policies. The German government has set itself an ambitious goal. We want to become an upskilling country. To achieve this, we will introduce education leave. In other words, paid time off for continuing education and training. We will also do much more to promote continuing education and training. We want to prepare today's workers for the work of tomorrow. My fourth and last point. What is the impact of artificial intelligence on our societies? In some countries, the benefits of new technologies are not shared equally at all. Some people are afraid to lose their jobs because of automation. or they work as digital day laborers under poor working conditions. But others contribute to technology's developments. Their incomes continue to grow. We must do something against this. Our instruments include continuing education and training, good labor market policies, and a strengthening of workers' rights, including in the platform economy. Another instrument are strong social safety nets, like the safety nets we have in Germany. Shaping digital structural change. This will be the big challenge of this decade. And I'm glad that we have the OECD as a strong partner in this field. Again, I would like to thank Secretary General Corman and the many experts who have contributed to AI WIPs. I wish you a successful conference.
A big thank you to Minister Heil for these remarks. Here in the studio in Paris, I think there was widespread agreement with everything he said. Perhaps except one point, there was a little bit of unease here when the minister said that it came without danger to suggest any Netflix movie. That's not the case in my family. It's not totally danger-free. But apart from that, I think we agree on everything. Those were truly great remarks. We thank the minister for them, and we also thank, of course, Germany for their continued support. Indeed, we are excited to announce today that the OECD AI WIPs program will continue. Thank you so much for the generous support from the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Thank you also for the insights on how this is affecting jobs and society. We will now move on and hear more about the education and skills angle with remarks this time live from Kersti Kaljulaid, former president of Estonia. Kersti, it's so good of you to join us. Thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good to see Secretary General again, and also to hear from German Ministry. And of course, I'm really happy that the OECD is seriously looking into AI questions and being a kind of a lab to develop our thinking on how we should move forward into this brave new world. Because while I do agree, of course, that technologies do pose questions and risks as well, I mean, new technologies are, in this sense, no difference from a good old axe. I mean, you can use the axe to cut heads or cut trees, and I mean, it works both ways, but it's never the fault of the technology, whatever it is. And this also applies for artificial intelligence and definitely also the Web3 tools, where we must be very sure that we make the benefits for our societies to realize, while, of course, obviously controlling the risks as well. Estonia quite often has served as a digital technology development lab for public sector in the European Union, which allows maybe also in its ecosystem to answer some of these questions, which also Secretary General and also Mr. Minister have today here posed, because Estonian government work basically runs online, all services are online. And obviously, if you have once are with all your services online, your citizens ask you also to keep the technology up to date, which means that if private sector is moving forward in its technology development and therefore changing the service offer, the government practically always has to look into this technology and also respond. And the same applies, of course, to artificial intelligence. Estonia has over the time developed about 80 test projects to run in our e-governance ecosystem. And indeed, some of these results of these projects give also answers to many future questions. For example, if you think about how our schools need to change nowadays, in education, when I went to school and I was 10, what I knew, my classmates mostly knew as well. There might have been slight difference based on what your parents have told you or what you have read, but basically child's knowledge was a function of child's age. Now this is totally disappeared, which means that you cannot anymore teach a class full of children who are the same age, the same lesson, which means you need actually individual training, teaching pathways for all hundreds of thousands of children. Here in Estonian system, we have highlighted 2 of such projects, which is automated e-learning and automated e-teaching. The objective of that is that each and every child has their own curriculum, where teacher does not teach them, but supports learning process. There will be feedback, and there also has to be next individual pathway designed for a child. These are two examples how artificial intelligence are tentatively entering the Estonian education system. Also, of course, in all other service provision which Estonia is offering, there are tens of such preliminary proactive services, as I call them. What does it mean, proactive service? A digital service which is always started by a citizen itself. Estonian citizens have to flag online that they are demanding, let's say, a social service from a government. Let's imagine you've had a baby. Now you exceed the e-governance system and you demand child support, which is universal in Estonia. Now our citizens are not very happy that they need to apply, because they all know that with modern technologies, when the government anyway knows that the baby has been born already, because there is a notion in e-health and the parents have named the baby, and the baby already has a digital identity. And the government knows the bank account number of the parents because they are being paid salaries, they're paying taxes. So the parents now ask, why do I need to apply? Support is, not means tested, so I don't need even to say how much I earn. Anyway, the government knows how much I earn because we declare our taxes online. So all this data is there in the databases. And now the citizens ask, private sector prompts me to use services. Why cannot government do the same for me? And we say, yes, government can. But we also need to be very clear that to protect further our citizens, similarly like we did in e-government 1.0, in this new world where artificial intelligence enters the government service provision, we need a new agreement. Minister of Justice, Minister of Internal Affairs are currently going through of what needs to change in our digital ecosystem, where a certain amount of limiting principles apply, which functioned really well with the first generation of services, like, for example, once only principle, the principle that data belongs to people. The third principle, very important, which now is under the question indeed, is government never looked upon the data with these eyes that aggregated data from different data sets could give information to the government. But if citizens want to have proactive services, then to a certain extent they have to opt into such a system where they allow government to synthesize different data from different databases and come to their help if the government sees there has been an event. Very simple service, maybe to make it easier to understand. In Estonia, retired people are entitled to top up to their pension if they live alone. This data is in the government databases. Now, retired people get this payment without knowing such a service exists. Therefore, they don't have to apply because government has all the necessary data. Of course, nobody is against such a service in the system because you simply get the payment. But we also have a test service which deals with education and training of our young people. This is a service which, according to the law, gathers information about young people who do not work, who are not staying at home with small children, and who are not also at school. So young people who may have lost their way in this life. And the government has the right, according to one law, to go and put this data together. Of course, it's done automatically. It's an AI-based service. And then ask the social worker or the local government where such a person lives to go and offer help. Now, this service already needs a higher level of opt-in and opt-out discussions. Right now, we are piloting, learning about these services. But if we want to have more and more of them, we have to agree with our citizens a new protected legal space, which at the same time would still be permissive legal space. Because in a way, this is also an individual pathway based on government data, where government is trying to nudge people, to help people. But it has to be extremely limited. For example, people definitely must have an opt-out of all these kinds of services. And this cannot be related to one law or one service. And I would go even further, not to one generation of technologies as well, because the current AI capabilities, let's admit, they are relatively limited. It's a little AI worm, which goes through databases and aggregates some kind of data, which is not drawing conclusions, well, which are too heavy based on this data. But what about future? We don't want this kind of data aggregations to start predicting what people might do next. This should be strictly forbidden. And we shouldn't today, because today AI is not capable of making this kind of predictions. We should nevertheless already today, while we are agreeing the legal framework for AI service provision in our systems, we should already agree for the next generations of data. I really like the example of Minister about the data autobahn, the data highway, and the fact that we need rules and regulation. Indeed true, but we had 100 years to develop our traffic code before I arrived at the autobahn. Right now, we don't have that luxury. Tech cycle is so short, legal cycle is so long, that we have to try and regulate already for AI, which is really, really smart, and still make sure that this legislation allows data use. Let us also know how this data, if once collected and made anonymous, can be analyzed, who is responsible, and who has also to dispose of this data. But what I would also want to see is that this kind of legal development should not try to describe pathways, precisely because we cannot describe a pathway for each and every tech generation. We absolutely have to describe the general outcome principles and regulate by objective. We have to define these objectives and then be ready for future generations, whichever technology, whichever generation of technology, whichever sector, education, work, where we are currently in. We need to have a common set of principles deciding always on the objectives. And then tech developers have the responsibility to show us that they are applying these kinds of principles. Actually, it's exactly the same as we did in the old code analog world, where we also said, and governments have made promises to citizens that they keep their data safe and do not use their data unless this is provided in the law. Problem, of course, that in the paper world, it was impossible for citizens to verify whether government is keeping its promise. In digital world, it has to be possible for citizens to verify that governments are keeping their word, because the main guiding principle always in Estonian laboratory of AI and tech services has been that the data does not belong to government. The data still belongs always to the people themselves. They always have to approve the data use. They always have to approve the aggregation of data. But if we now want to give more space and leeway for artificial intelligence in this service, then this needs a new national agreement on how we handle our data for the benefits of our people. That's all I wanted to say now, and I'm of course ready to discuss whichever aspect in e-learning, in education, individual pathways, or general principles of Estonian digital governance laboratory, which nowadays really inform us very well also the opportunities of using AI in this ecosystem.
Look, thank you so much, Kersti. This was highly fascinating. I'm still trying to come to terms with this metaphor of yours of us driving an autobahn, perhaps without speed limits and without having invented the right regulation yet. It may be stimulating. We may go fast, but it could also be dangerous. I think that's a metaphor that probably could be further developed. What you've done for us here today really is provide very political and very everyday life examples of what we're talking about here. We often give speeches and papers here at the OECD about the risks and benefits and dilemmas and trade-offs, but you've actually provided some real life examples of why this is difficult, but also why there are so many opportunities here. I was fascinated to hear about the 80 projects you mentioned, but also your thoughts on the difference between government take-up and private sector take-up of AI. Could you tell us perhaps a bit more about the policies that Estonia has been implementing in this or other areas in the past few years?
Well, first and foremost, we in Estonia, we do not believe that we regulate private sector separately from the public sector, which is extremely important because, you know, government, if it is regulating these aliens there in the private sector, then, I mean, it doesn't regulate in a most reasonable way. In our case, because government is similarly grappling to come to terms with the new technologies which are becoming available, and at the same time needing to keep the trust of people in the data and our databases and our way of running the government. This means that we are constantly discussing in our parliament what is acceptable in this new, brave, wonderful technological world and where we need to change. And indeed, one of the biggest debates we are currently now having is that based on these kind of pilot projects using artificial intelligence in government service, before we allow them to become a normality, we need to tell our people that, I mean, this is how you will get the services which you want to be events-based, because we see people demand the government to be proactive. People do not want to apply. They want the government to be there for them when they need. They want the government to recognize even that, for example, in their e-health system, there is something which flags a necessary, further analysis or test and so on, so on. People want this, but at the same time, we must make sure that while there is a public demand for it, it is still safe, because having the public demand does not free the Parliament of Estonia or the ministries of Estonia from the necessity to make sure that the system is closely regulated. Very often people have thought that the Estonian digital ecosystem is a wild west of internet service users, and Estonians simply do not understand. And actually, it is far tighter regulation. It's very tight regulation, but it tries to be an objective-based regulation. And maybe the most remarkable development which I see here, I mean, we always react. For example, if the gig economy started and there was the question of Uber or our own unicorn Bolt and so on, the parliament came together and put together a legal text which allowed, I mean, these services in a legally permissive environment to thrive. But what I now see is which is most remarkable, is that we try to really not go sectorally and not go anymore based on one technology, but to indeed take a view which is long-term and try to come to a system where citizens understand that, I mean, system is legally permissive at the same time protected. And how we try to make sure that it covers new tech ideas, it's very interesting actually. We have generated a system which is called Accelerator Estonia. And this means that the Estonian government is calling for offers of new technologies which could serve our e-government, which means which could use our data and our databases and so on, be them in whichever sector. And the government goes and invests together with the startup or more established company into developing their service. Government in Estonia does not need to invest because there is lack of seed financing or development financing for smart digital ideas. Estonia has 7 unicorns and the pyramid therefore has to be extremely wide at the basement. So there is no lack of capital for new technologies. But if the government puts its own skin in the game, which is the idea of Accelerator Estonia, then it is forced to make sure that the legal environment is constantly stimulated by these new ideas coming in. And I consider this the most important element of making sure that we have created a kind of positive tech acceptance and inclusion cycle into e-government of Estonia. Because, I mean, if governments are, relatively happy with what they have, they tend to sit back comfortably and enjoy others catching up with them. And we want to stay at this forefront of tech development as really quick followers. And therefore, such a system has been agreed upon. Let's see how it functions. Will our parliament will be able to, I mean, accommodate in our legal space all these new ideas? But that's what they are at least promising to those people who come to Accelerator Estonia.
And you surely are at the forefront. So I guess for you, it's not least a matter of maintaining that lead or that edge. I wanted maybe, Kirsty, just to stay for a minute with this difference between companies and the public sector, because I know you want AI uptake in both companies and in the public sector, and you have a strategy for that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that dual strategy and where you are encountering perhaps difficulties with uptake in government vis-a-vis the private sector?
The biggest difficulty, of course, is that if the private sector companies go ahead, and as we know, then digital services is wildly globally not so regulated, which I personally find very good, because if we start regulating, there is a high risk that we will fragment our wonderful global services sector. And I definitely rely on Matthias Korman to make sure that once we, go forward in making sure that our tech space is globally safe and secure, and we go forward in using identity tools, driving anonymity out, using more timestamps, etc., that the standards which OECD will be able to provide us with will keep the market open. We do not want protectionists to creep into this system. That would be the biggest danger actually for Estonia. This is a huge risk for us because our companies heavily rely on this kind of global services open market. Estonian workforce is maximum 700,000 people, but one of our unicorns actually employs globally 300,000. See, what is our reliance on external job markets? And these are digital services. They all, if you talk to whichever Estonian unicorn, they have a handful of people in Tallinn and loads of people elsewhere globally. They don't care where they are. And therefore, having a safe and sound system where data is also freely allowed to move, based that we are able to verify and control who is looking at which data where globally. This is something which, we have to rely on OECD cooperation. We can, of course, settle inside Estonia whichever smart regulation for new techs, and we can provide, therefore, information to other governments and also OECD, for that matter, how this technology could function safely in a data ecosystem where government data is involved. But for us, the biggest risk is that if external factors regulate to the death the global services market, then this we cannot control. And therefore, this is very important for us that we do regulate, we guarantee safety, we drive away anonymity, but we keep openness. And I believe that the crypto tools are actually a wonderful opportunity for us to achieve all what we want. For us, we don't differentiate public and private sector, frankly. We try not to because our people are used to having good private sector level service also from the government, and they do not accept any lower levels. And second, why should you have a dual kind of legislation? I think it's extremely unfair to force both your citizens and your enterprises to cope with two varied sets of rules. Why?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense, Kathy. Thanks for pointing that out. Thank you so much for your time. Before we let you go, maybe just one final question. With your vast experience from your own country, but also I know you have vast international experience and interest. If you look to the future, what are the kind of policy actions needed a little bit down the road? And then for us at the OECD, where do you think we could specifically help? You already touched upon it a little bit in the conversation, but if there's anything else on your wish list, we would be very much in a listening mode here in Paris on where you think we can make a difference.
Yeah, I think we need globally a system which would help people to identify, and also while they have done so, to create safe encrypted channels for exchange of data. We cannot achieve this alone. We cannot achieve this within the European Union context. We can only do it globally. And if we think, how can we do it? If there is already a digital economy which has managed to connect us all up, the billions of people, into one system, and it has also given us, for example, the crypto tools to make sure that we are actually able in a diversified format to keep track what is happening where and when and who is doing it, then we should look into bringing these tools into making them to serve us, to drive the general anonymity of the system. Because people, if, for example, we trust here in our e-health database, let's say some companies from somewhere to use anonymized data, we still want to know who was looking at this data and what they did to this data. And there will be billions, trillions of this kind of queries globally ongoing. It only can be done in a decentralized format and followed by the tools of the Web3, I feel. So we have to look into it. And we have to be, in this sense, creative, that we do not first say it's not allowed and only then start to gradually reopen some opportunities. This risk, by the way, is also the risk of free world in general losing out to autocrats who are not bound by our worries and our issues. We have to make sure that the global services market remains open, is legally permissive to new technologies, gives assurance to our citizens, and is safely set up and designed and standardized to make sure that businesses who invest against this regulation can trust that their economic models do not come under pressure, similarly as we now see in the current technologies that, I mean, companies offering global anonymous services are blamed for anonymity, whereas it is obvious that only governments can provide digital identities.
Kersti Kaljulaid, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon, from your big picture analysis to very concrete examples from the frontier of national politics in your home country to the frontier of the global arena where we try to tackle this. This has been immensely useful. We're only 4 or 5 people here in the studio, but I will see if we can summon an applause and make it audible. It's been a real pleasure. Very, very good to have you with us. So as we now close this high-level session, let me just very briefly reflect a bit on what both President Kaljulaid and Minister Heil were stating, and highlight maybe 3 ways forward for us here at the OECD as part of this AI WIPS project. First, I think it's clear that we need more evidence and we need better evidence. There are many theories out there about the impact of AI on our societies and what policies could be most effective. As one of our world's leading institutions for evidence-based policymaking, we at the OECD, we've always been committed to the task mentioned by Minister Heil of building up a more reliable knowledge base on AI. That's why over the past 2 years, we have tried to deliver findings on how AI is affecting training, on how it's changing employment, on how it's being unevenly adopted across firms of different sizes, and as former President Kaljulaid said, also maybe unevenly between the private and the public sector. All of these reports are publicly available online, but more is coming. I'm thinking of a report on the ethics of AI use in the workplace. We also have a report coming on social partners and AI just in the next few months. And going forward, we will develop new AI indicators, not least on skills, and we will measure the impact of AI on specific groups of workers. That's one cluster. Second, we need to move towards a focus on potential policy reform, but also best practices of governance. The OECD AI classification framework that many spoke about today and which we launched and the SG also mentioned will be particularly helpful in this work. Are there, for example, specific gaps in existing legislation that policymakers need to address? The next phase of AI WIPS will specifically look at this. We'll also look at the concrete implementation of AI in management practices, public employment services, and for forecasting skill demand and supply for the green economy. Very important, of course, as well. And then third, lastly, we must continue to engage with key stakeholders. This annual conference represents the pinnacle of our efforts to do just that. We have speakers from all parts of the AI world, from engineers to academics, from union leaders to CEOs, from technical specialists to commissioners. And some of you are tuning in, I know, as far away as from Australia to us here in Paris. This conference builds on the multitude of bilateral and multilateral stakeholder engagement fora for OECD analysis, or that we analysts here at the OECD participate in. And that really is what strengthens our ability to get a sense of what is happening on the ground, and not least why it's happening on the ground. This work again builds on the OECD.AI principles, which try to promote the use of AI, or a use of AI that is innovative and trustworthy, and also respects human rights and democratic values. Through this, the AI WIPS program, with more cutting-edge evidence, with more support for policy making, and more stakeholder engagement, the OECD will continue to support its member countries, its constituents, also beyond membership, as we try to navigate what AI will bring in the years to come. So with that, let me close this session. Thank again our speakers and the audience for joining us today. But stay tuned, because in a minute, next up, we'll have a panel discussion on how human resource managers, employment services, and the platform economy are using AI to match workers to vacancies. Thank you very much for this session, and stay tuned. Thank you.